Hello, everybody. Our guest today is Jeffrey Sanders, who's a member of the Bain Advisor Network. Thanks for making time, Jeff. Our mutual
Thank you.
friend, Ben Clark, suggested we get acquainted, and I'm very glad that he did. You've had a very interesting set of experiences recently in top marketing, commercial, and analytics roles at B2C online natives, and I wonder if you could recap those for us a bit.
Sure. So, I'm really glad we've had a chance to connect here. And I'll go a little bit further back in time. So, coming out of business school back in 2005, I knew I wanted to get a data-driven marketing role. And I actually found one in a marketing leadership development program at Citi, predominantly in Citi's credit cards business, and ended up staying there for almost 10 years. I spent the first 5 years in very traditional marketing channels like call centers and direct mail, and then pivoted to spend the next 5 in digital marketing roles. I spent the next 2 years at Gilt Group, where I ran digital marketing, CRM, and loyalty, and was also part of the team that sold the company to Hudson's Bay. And after that, I found myself back in financial services at Betterment, the online investment advisor, where I spent 2 years running acquisition and CRM, so really end-to-end performance marketing. And then went back to e-commerce and was at Casper for about 2 years, where I ran growth, analytics, and the North America e-commerce business, and left Casper in July.
So that's a really cool set of experiences, and I'm always interested in the logic behind these moves. Can you tell us a little bit about how they happened?
Sure. Well, it certainly wasn't my intention to bounce back and forth between financial services and e-commerce, but there were two common threads in those transitions. Number one is finding roles where I could bring together data and technology to drive marketing and therefore business performance. And then number two, following great people. And so for me, much more than the industry, that thread has been that data-driven marketing as it existed in B2C companies. But I've also had the good fortune of following some great leaders. I followed a great leader from Citi named Michelle Peluso, who brought me to Gilt, where she was the CEO at the time. She's now the CMO at IBM. And then I followed Gilt's CMO to Betterment, following a great mentor and friend named Clay Cowan, who happens to be a partner at one of Bain's competitors. And that's also something that's been important to me as a leader, to bring great folks with me to the new companies that I've gone to. And then in terms of Casper, I didn't actually know anyone there at the time I started discussing it, but as someone who really wanted to be a performance marketer at scale, the opportunity at Casper was just a great fit.
Now, you made the transition from a major financial brand to working at all these different insurgents. Aside from some of the obvious stuff, what was different for you?
Honestly, the biggest difference was one of process. At Citi, there was always a way that something was done, and relatively clear answers on who needed to approve. At the insurgents, as you called them, there's not a 200-year history of how to get things done. And so actually, and this was one of the biggest changes that I had to go through, it wasn't clear who needed to approve or who had the final say. And so as I got more comfortable with the situation, I had to decide more and more that it was me. And that is an uncomfortable transition. And so what I've tried to do is build some of the process that's existed in bigger companies into insurgents so that it's not necessarily the Wild West.
That point about unclear decision rights, decision rules is actually a really fascinating one that most people don't talk about. Aside from that, what else surprised you about that transition?
I think another big surprise was the speed at which I could work. This was sometimes thrilling, and literally I found shortly after joining Gilt that there was something that my team could do in an afternoon that had taken months at a larger company. But that speed and nimbleness also brings some challenges in that, sometimes in cases we were nimble simply because we could be. And sometimes, I think this is less marketing and more human psychology, sometimes, bias towards action meant that it felt better to do something versus doing nothing. And maybe at times doing nothing might have made sense. But that nimbleness and the ability to make decisions, move quickly, has been really positive.
Very cool. Now, nimble and action, there's always sort of objects associated with those descriptors and nouns and so forth. Just tell us a little bit about how you approach those opportunities. What frames did you apply for sort of understanding what was going on, and how did you conceive of what specific actions you wanted to try to take to drive performance up?
So I think what this nimbleness means in an ideal world is that you don't need every hit to be a home run, right? If you're being nimble, you basically get more at bats. And while you might strike out a few times, you can hit a bunch of singles and doubles. Where if you only get a hit in one hit in the game or one hit in the inning or whatever the right metaphor is, to win, everyone's got to be a home run. And so, given that, the approach that I tried to take was really testing things in market as much as possible and getting real consumer data versus spending tons of time building a case a priori. If the costs of actually doing an in-market test are low, it's much better than sort of taking the time to be a little bit more academic about it. And then, frankly, if the cost of iteration are low, it's iterating in market, right? Again, and trying to improve things because I think the odds are small of hitting a home run every time on the first bat. This is a process change, but it's also a cultural change. As in general, people are averse to failure. And so part of the obligation of a manager is giving people a safe place to fail, as long as they have a good hypothesis for what they're testing, and as long as they're committed to learning from failure. I think the benefits of that are pretty significant.
Very interesting. Now, can you be a bit more specific about, like, for example, what were some of the key insights you developed for actually improving performance along the way? What were some of the big hits that really made a difference in the different opportunities you addressed?
And so a few things come to mind there. I'd say the first is that a lot of companies, the worlds of acquiring new customers and getting value from existing customers or retaining them are pretty separate. And that's true even in some of the smaller companies that I've worked at. But there really is a deeper connection between those two parts of the customer lifecycle, particularly as more and more companies think about LTV and think about LTV to CAC, as a metric against which to manage the business, right? The more that those worlds can be brought closely together, the more you can create a virtuous cycle of performance to drive the business. Another, and this is an area that I'm deeply passionate about, is marketing attribution, and that there's a fundamental difference between marketing attribution and incrementality, right? To me, just, being able to measure something is attribution. Understanding how it changes consumer behavior is incrementality. And often those terms are used interchangeably, but they're really, really different. And I think it's critical for companies to focus on the incrementality approach versus just attribution. And then finally, I'm clearly a data-driven marketer, and so my head naturally goes towards the numbers and the targeting and the segmentation. But great creative can be just as powerful as all of those levers in some cases, and so that can be easy for folks like me to overlook. And so it's really important, to either have those self-reinforcement mechanisms to focus on that, or to be working with the right people to be the sort of that complementary skill set and that complementary approach to marketing.
Yeah, that self-awareness about what you bring to the table as a marketer is really kind of so important. Knowing what you do bring and what you're missing, and making sure you complement yourself with the right kinds of talent. Really important. Sure. How did you balance improving kind of near-term performance with progress on the underlying capabilities that you need to kind of sustain that over time? What were some of the trade-offs that you made?
Cesar, it's funny because at a lot of companies, those are viewed as opposing sides of the spectrum, and I don't think they should be, I guess. I'm generally not a fan of monolithic releases of new capabilities. When you approach it that way, often the requirements or specs that someone figured out for that release might have been done 9 months ago and aren't relevant anymore. And so that's frankly too long, right? In the world that we're living in. I mean, does anyone remember what it was like in the end of December, 9 months ago? The world is completely different. And so I think, the approach to enhancing underlying capabilities should really be iterative, right? Where those iterations are tested in market to see if they're driving performance. And then that data drives some of the future roadmap. Now, it's never going to be perfect, and there are certainly projects that take months and maybe in cases years to build, but then it's just really important to build into the process a way to reality check with what is the state of the team, what is the state of marketing, at some point after the requirements are quote unquote set in stone. folks who are familiar with agile development versus waterfall approaches, they're probably hearing things that they're familiar with as I'm talking about this, but this isn't just a development thing. It's the way the world is changing. I mean, I'd say that on average, 40% of what my team did at any point in time didn't exist a year before, right? So if that's the case, how would anyone have known to put the underlying capabilities to support those on the roadmap? And again, don't take away from this that you shouldn't do long-term planning, but there needs to be flexibility and agility in that to make sure that you're actually building for the world that you're in, not the world that you thought you would be in a year ago.
Right. Now, near and dear to my heart, one of the places where we typically have this trade-off felt most acutely is in the world of trying to apply machine learning and advanced analytics to some of these opportunities, because you obviously want to see if you can get out of the gate and get some momentum going. But on the other hand, sometimes building big pipelines can actually take some time. How are there specific examples of how you applied those techniques that you talk about, and kind of what you took away and learned from them?
Sure. Machine learning has been becoming more and more prevalent on the paid media side of the world over the past few years, and I think that's driving a lot of the success that the digital platforms, Facebook, Google, Amazon, are generating. And they also allow companies to, rely more on in-house teams versus using agencies. And so I think there's a lot there that some folks don't even think about as being machine learning, but it's really powering all of the lookalikes and bidding optimizations in those tools. For one of the areas that's been near and dear to my heart since I started in the digital world has been around website optimization. And so, an example that I'll speak about is, there's all too often there's an argument about what should be on the homepage. Right? Doesn't matter what the company is. Doesn't matter. That's always what are people going to see?
Yeah.
And that argument, if you think about it, is about determining what's right on average. But the power of machine learning is supplementing that with how do you service the long tail. And so there are some examples that I can think of where, as opposed to having one homepage at a company that I've been at, we've actually gone into key periods of time with having 4 versions of the homepage,
right.
letting a tool optimize effectively in real time for which was driving the best performance. And this is an out-of-the-box capability in a tool that is not that expensive. And so
right.
that's not the sort of thing that should take years for a company to build and years for a company to use. And we're able to see a lift in website conversion simply by letting the tool optimize, basically change every hour what was shown on the website. And that is even a baby step, right? Because that's still optimizing for what's right on average in that hour of time or whatever the period was.
Yeah.
Where it can start to get even better is, how is it optimizing differently for traffic coming from emails versus
right.
traffic clicking through from search versus direct load? Because those are very different customer mindsets, and there's a lot of sophistication there, but it also means you don't have to get there right away.
Now, that's a very natural transition to another topic I wanted to cover with you, which is we get a lot of questions from clients that sound like, have I got the right ad tech or MarTech stack? How did you go about assessing and changing yours?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think it often assumes that there's a perfect or a right answer to that question, and I actually don't. There's certainly not a perfect answer, and I think there's better answers there. A lot of companies seem to think about checking the boxes. Do I have whatever acronym? Like, do I have a CDP? Do I have a DMP? Do I have a data lake? And I think it's important to remember that none of those have value in and of themselves, and actually there's cost, both financial and opportunity cost to building
right.
each one of them.
Definitely.
But it's really more about what are you going to do with those tools.
Yeah.
And so the way I think about it is I think companies should think about their key business objectives. What are their existing consumer behaviors of their customers or prospects, and the behaviors they want to drive, and then what is the right mix of people, process, and technology to meet those goals. It could be, and maybe this is heretical, it could be that it's less expensive to hire a junior member of the team, 1 or 2 years out of college, than to undertake a significant cross-functional tech build. right? If
Yeah.
what you're looking to achieve are relatively straightforward. And so um, I don't just assume that building an expensive and complicated ad tech and martech stack is going to revolutionize your business.
Yeah. Yeah.
And maybe that comes off as a little bit too negative about technology. I mean, I believe that's a huge driver of marketing performance, but there are times where this attitude has led me to add tech to the stack, particularly around media measurement in worlds where I'm spending a lot of money. And frankly, there are times where I've chosen not to add technology to the stack. And so, for instance, for me, the use cases around DMPs are becoming a little bit less clear in a world where the cookie may be crumbling a little bit. So just checking the box in that acronym probably isn't enough anymore.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting because I think back to this interplay between performance and capability, to your example about, hiring the junior person to do I'm putting words in your mouth, but a manual integration where maybe you would have done an automated one. The idea that sometimes if you are sort of continuously focused on improving performance, you won't think of that hiring of that person as sort of, the end of what you've done. It's sort of a step along a journey to actually continue to get better that may lead you down a path to automation, but you're fundamentally about performance, not necessarily, you're not confusing the means for the ends in this case. I think that's a big challenge for people right now because they're faced with this blizzard of things they could use and assume that if they pick the right one, that all will be fine. So
Sure.
Shift gears a little bit. Tell us a little bit about your teams. Kind of what did they look like? How did you organize them? How did you develop them?
Sure. And maybe this is surprising, but I've actually had fairly traditional structures to my team. And so, for instance, at Casper, where I was the SVP of growth, analytics, and e-commerce, I had 5 direct reports. I had a head of performance media, a head of CRM, a head of analytics, head of digital product, and an e-commerce leader. Mm-hmm. That's a very, very basic sort of functionally driven approach. But for me, this worked because, the skills that made people really successful in each of those disciplines were different. But what that made happen is that put the burden on me and my leadership team to act as that integration layer between the disciplines. Yeah. And so, I think we did a pretty good job of that. But because, again, particularly at those junior levels, there's such different skill sets, it's hard to find generalists across all of those until you get relatively experienced. From a development perspective, my personal philosophy is one of servant leadership. And so I can only be successful if the people on my team are successful. And so something that I spend a lot of time on is being accessible to the team. Mm-hmm. So having weekly office hours that anyone on the team could show up at, building team culture, working to proactively connect the dots between disciplines on the team. And I also spend a lot of time getting to know the folks on my teams, not just my direct reports, so that I can have a sense of what their development needs are when additional projects or opportunities come up and can send the right things their way.
Let's shift gears a bit and look ahead. So the pandemic is driving e-com channels from, one of kind of the dominant from basically being one of the channels available to be kind of the dominant place in the line. It used to be that like a physical retailer would say, well, e-com is my biggest store, right? Right. But now it's much more central than that. What are some things that you think multi-channel retailers can still learn from the digital natives? And conversely, even if they don't have physical stores, what are the things you think some of the digital natives with booming businesses can actually learn from the more traditional folks?
Sure. Well, for multi-channel retailers, I think it's particularly important in this period in time for the digital experience to be top-notch. And these days, your website, maybe more than your stores, needs to be the face of your brand. And frankly, that applies to your mobile app too. And that's the experience by which customers will judge your brand. I just saw some news this morning that customers are much less likely to go into a store for Black Friday, Cyber Monday than they have been in previous years.
Surprise, yeah.
I'm not sure that I would have wanted to run into a store at 5 a.m, but if that's right, if that's the consumer mentality, that digital experience has to capture all of that demand that normally would have been waiting for doorbusters on the curb. And for digital natives, think it's important to think about the purpose of a store, right? A store, a physical store, right? A store is transactional, but for a lot of folks, a physical store has been a place where people want to come and spend time, right? And
Hmm.
do so again and again. And you see that in, in some of the experiences that traditional retailers are putting into their stores, and certainly what some of the mall owner and operators are putting into their malls. And so, that's getting people to come in and spend time and do it again and again and again. And so, how are you going to do that with your brand, right? In a world where you don't necessarily have a physical experience. And yes, it's possible to do an experiential pop-up, but I don't know how, that should be the sort of the future of the business. And so, if it's not going to be a promotion and it's not going to be a Facebook ad, well, what is it going to be? And I don't claim to have the answer, but I think it's an important question
You
to ask.
know, that's a great point. I'm one of the things I'm struck by on this point is how small businesses actually sometimes lead the way. They include things like videos that show the product in use. They explain how the product is assembled or can be repaired, or any number of different sort of things that sort of show it in the wild. And that that sometimes is actually a form of entertainment for the people who
Absolutely.
come to shop, because they can sort of see themselves in that experience. They can share that. They can get comfortable and familiar with the product in a way that actually, when it comes time to actually press buy, they do. So I think that's a really interesting point you raise about the role of the store. A question I always ask: how do you keep up? What do you read? What do you watch? What do you listen to?
So, from a marketing perspective, I tend to be, I don't know, maybe relatively old school. So I read a lot of newsletters in the space,
Yeah,
and some of which I've been subscribing to for years, and then the new ones, coming in or filtering out. And so some of my favorites are some of the Media Post newsletters,
yeah,
Ad Exchanger, Digiday, and even, Harvard Business Review's management tip of the day. That's, someone who thinks a lot about the team. That's important.
yeah.
In terms of what I watch, a lot of football, and
Well,
excited for football season to start in 2 days.
yeah. In a very, very strange and different way this year, that's for sure.
For
So
sure.
I'm glad you mentioned Ad Exchanger. That's a favorite of mine too. The podcast series, I think Zach does a really great job with that. It's a little inside baseball-y, but if you really want to keep up with what's going on and
Yeah.
understand it, that's the place to be. So finally, we're really grateful to have had the chance to work with you as an advisor. What's next for you? And
Yeah. So I'll be starting a new role in the near future, and I can't wait to tell everyone about it.
very cool. We'll come back and hopefully, if you're game,
Great.
do another one of these conversations when you're settled there. But advance congrats on that.
Thank you.
But Jeff, thank you so much for taking the time to do this. I know you're very busy, and we really appreciate it. But I think just hearing from people with your very hands-on, practical frontline experience is incredibly valuable for everybody, and we really appreciate your making the time.
Well, thank you, Caesar. I appreciate it, and always happy to do one of these.
Fantastic. All right.
Thanks so much.